There are relenting, hammering down on the cracked pavement like a relentless rhythm of chaos. Thomas trudged through the desolate outskirts of the city, the dim streetlights barely cutting through the thick veil of mist. His footsteps echoed hollowly, swallowed by the emptiness around him. He wasn't sure what had brought him here, a restless urge to escape the suffocating walls of his apartment, perhaps, or the desperate hope that inspiration might strike in the most unlikely of places. Ahead, a silhouette loomed through the rain, a decrepit warehouse, its rusted roof sagging under the weight of neglect. The windows were shattered, jagged edges jutting like broken teeth, and graffiti marred its once pristine walls. Thomas hesitated for a moment, a strange unease prickling at the back of his neck. But the pull of curiosity was stronger. He stepped closer, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he pushed open the heavy metal door. The hinges screeched in protest, the sound slicing through the silence like a scream. Inside, the air was damp and cold, filled with the smell of mildew and decay. Thomas swept the beam of his flashlight across the cavernous space. Piles of discarded furniture and broken crates littered the floor, and shadows danced menacingly along the walls. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, his heart beating a little faster. As he ventured deeper into the warehouse, a faint noise reached his ears, a soft, muffled sound, almost like a whimper. He froze, straining to hear over the pounding of the rain on the roof. There it was again, barely audible but unmistakable. His pulse quickened as he turned toward the source of the sound. The flashlight's beam landed on a corner of the room, where an old piano stood shrouded in darkness. Its once elegant frame was warped and covered in dust, the keys yellowed with age. Beneath the piano sat a small cardboard box, damp and sagging under the weight of the moisture. The whimpering was coming from inside. Thomas's breath caught. He took a tentative step forward, the floor creaking ominously under his weight. As he approached the box, a sudden creak from above made him glance up sharply. High above, a wooden beam hung precariously, its rusted supports groaning under the strain. His gut twisted with dread as he noticed the beam swaying slightly, directly above the box. The next moments were a blur. A loud crack shattered the stillness, and the beam began to give way, tilting dangerously. Without thinking, Thomas lunged forward, adrenaline surging through his veins. He grabbed the box, yanking it out of the way just as the beam came crashing down with a deafening thud. Splinters flew in every direction, and a cloud of dust rose around him, choking the air. Coughing, Thomas staggered back, clutching the box to his chest. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. For a moment, he just stood there, his hands trembling as the weight of what had just happened sank in. The beam lay shattered on the floor, right where the box had been. If he'd been a second too late. He shook his head, trying to steady his breathing. The whimpering had grown louder now, frantic and urgent. Carefully, he set the box down and knelt beside it. His flashlight illuminated the soggy cardboard and the makeshift blanket inside. Slowly, he lifted the flaps, his hands hesitant, almost afraid of what he might find. The sight that greeted him stole his breath. 7 tiny golden retriever puppies, their fur matted and soaked, huddled together in a pitiful heap. Their eyes, barely open, blinked weakly against the harsh light. One of them, the smallest, let out a feeble cry, its tiny body trembling with cold and fear. Thomas's chest tightened as a wave of emotion crashed over him. Relief, disbelief, and a deep, aching sadness. How could anyone leave these helpless creatures here, in such a desolate, dangerous place? The absurdity of it all was overwhelming, but there was no time to dwell on the questions racing through his mind. He reached out gently, his hands brushing against the damp fur of the smallest puppy. Its fragile frame shivered at his touch, and he could feel the faint, rapid thrum of its heartbeat beneath his fingers. A surge of protectiveness rose within him. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "You're safe now." The puppies needed warmth, shelter, and care, and quickly. Thomas looked around the dilapidated warehouse, the shattered beam and shadows a stark reminder of the danger that still lingered. With renewed determination, he wrapped the box in his jacket, shielding the puppies from the cold. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, but he didn't hesitate. Clutching the box tightly, he made his way out of the warehouse and into the storm. The rain lashed against his face, soaking him to the bone, but he didn't falter. The puppies' lives depended on him now, and nothing else mattered. As he trudged through the downpour, the image of the piano and the fallen beam lingered in his mind, a haunting tableau of fragility and survival. The questions would have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was getting these 7 little lives to safety. The warmth of Thomas's small apartment stood in stark contrast to the storm raging outside. The soft glow of a table lamp illuminated the cozy living room where 7 tiny golden retriever puppies now rested on a makeshift bed of blankets. Thomas had worked tirelessly through the night, drying their soaked fur, feeding them small sips of water with a syringe, and ensuring they were as comfortable as possible. One by one, they began to settle, their tiny bodies curling into each other for warmth. The smallest one, whom Thomas had already started calling Doe, seemed to cling to him the most, letting out soft whimpers whenever he moved too far. It didn't take long for Thomas to name the others as well: Ree, Me, F.A., Sol, La, and Sai. Each name felt fitting, as though these puppies were the notes of an unfinished melody that fate had brought into his life. For a moment, as he sat cross-legged on the floor watching them sleep, Thomas allowed himself to feel the faintest glimmer of hope. The past few years had been a blur of creative stagnation and loneliness, his once thriving career as a pianist now reduced to sporadic gigs at small venues. But tonight, amidst the chaos, something stirred within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The image of the piano in the warehouse lingered in his mind. Its presence had been haunting, almost deliberate, as though it had been waiting for him. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, not of fear, but of curiosity. There was something about that piano, something that called to him. After ensuring the puppies were sound asleep, Thomas retrieved his laptop and began searching for any clues about the warehouse and the mysterious piano. The hours ticked by as he delved into online forums, local history websites, and old news articles. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that he stumbled upon something intriguing. A name: Walter Hensley. The name appeared in an article dated nearly 2 decades ago. Walter was described as a wandering pianist, a man who roamed the city's streets playing melancholic tunes on a battered piano he dragged with him wherever he went. His music, the article claimed, was both haunting and beautiful, drawing crowds who marveled at the raw emotion he poured into every note. But Walter's story was tinged with tragedy. He had lost his family in a fire years before and had since lived a nomadic life, carrying his grief with him in the form of music. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his heart heavy with an inexplicable sadness. He clicked through more articles, piecing together fragments of Walter's life. The last mention of him was nearly 10 years ago, when he reportedly disappeared without a trace. Witnesses claimed to have seen him playing one final time in a desolate part of town, near the very warehouse Thomas had been in last night. His mind raced. Could the piano in the warehouse really be Walter's? And if so, how had it ended up there, abandoned like a relic of a forgotten time? The thought sent a chill through him. It was as if the piano itself carried the weight of Walter's sorrow, left to decay in silence. A soft whimper broke Thomas's train of thought. He turned to see Doe stirring on the blanket, its tiny body stretching before curling back up with a small sigh. Thomas smiled faintly, his hand instinctively reaching out to stroke the puppy's head. The sensation was grounding, pulling him out of the spiraling questions and back into the present. "I guess it's just us now, huh?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The puppy nuzzled into his hand, as if in response. But the questions refused to fade. Thomas found himself staring at the screen again, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping against the edge of the laptop. The story of Walter and his piano was more than just a tale of loss. It was a mystery, one that Thomas felt inexplicably drawn to solve. As dawn broke, painting the room in soft hues of gold and pink, Thomas made a decision. He would return to the warehouse, this time with a clearer purpose. The piano, the box of puppies, Walter's story. It all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. But first, he had to make sure the puppies were cared for. Grabbing his phone, he called Dr. Emerson, who had helped him through the night with advice on their care. "Thomas," Dr. Emerson greeted groggily, "how are the little ones holding up?" "They're stable, for now," Thomas replied. "But I was hoping you could check on them in person. There's something I need to look into." Dr. Emerson hesitated before agreeing, promising to stop by later that morning. With the puppy's well-being temporarily entrusted to someone he trusted, Thomas turned his attention back to his plan. The thought of stepping into the eerie warehouse again sent a ripple of unease through him, but the pull of curiosity was stronger. Before leaving, he glanced at the sleeping puppies one last time. "You're my notes now," he said softly, "and every melody needs a story." The words felt heavier than he intended, as though they carried a deeper truth he had yet to uncover. With that, Thomas grabbed his coat and set off, the questions of the past pushing him forward. The warehouse stood as it had the night before, its rusted exterior and broken windows untouched by time. The morning light did little to soften its menacing silhouette against the gray sky, but Thomas felt a strange resolve as he approached. Clutching his flashlight, he pushed open the heavy door once more, the creaking hinges protesting against the intrusion. The familiar chill and damp air wrapped around him like an unwelcome guest. This time, Thomas knew exactly where to go. His steps echoed through the cavernous space, each one pulling him closer to the piano in the far corner. It stood in defiant silence, the same aura of mystery surrounding it. He ran his fingers along the dusty surface, his breath catching as memories of the previous night came rushing back, of the puppies, of the crashing beam, and of the inexplicable pull that had drawn him here. Steeling himself, Thomas knelt in front of the piano. The keys, though yellowed and cracked, seemed to hold a quiet dignity, as though they were waiting for someone to awaken their voice. He pressed one gently, and a hollow, off-tune note reverberated through the warehouse, sending a shiver down his spine. It felt almost alive, like a whisper from the past. His attention turned to the piano's frame. He examined its edges, looking for any clues. As his fingers brushed against the underside of the keyboard, they caught on something. A latch. Intrigued, he carefully flipped it open. The panel clicked softly, revealing a hidden compartment within the piano's frame. Inside, tucked away as if it were a treasure, was a weathered leather notebook. Its edges were frayed, and the once vibrant cover was now dulled to a deep brown. Thomas's hands trembled as he picked it up, the weight of the object feeling heavier than it should. For a moment, he simply stared at it, the questions swirling in his mind, nearly paralyzing him. Taking a deep breath, he opened the notebook. The first page greeted him with looping, elegant handwriting. "To those who find this, may music guide you as it once guided me." The signature at the bottom read, "Walter Hensley." Thomas's heart raced as he flipped through the pages. They were filled with sheet music, beautiful, haunting melodies that seemed to carry the weight of Walter's sorrow. But amidst the musical notes, there were words. Scribbled in the margins, sometimes scrawled hastily across entire pages, were fragments of Walter's story. One entry caught Thomas's eye, dated nearly a decade ago. "I found them today, 7 little souls lost in the cold. They were huddled together under an old tree, trembling and silent. I couldn't leave them there, not after everything I've lost. They are my family now, my last tether to this world." The words hit Thomas like a tidal wave. He could picture it clearly. Walter, alone and grieving, finding solace in the very same puppies Thomas had rescued. The connection felt almost surreal, as though the lives of these tiny creatures were threads weaving a tapestry between two men separated by years and tragedy. Another entry, written in a shakier hand, revealed more. "My strength is fading. The music that once flowed so freely now eludes me, and my hands tremble too much to play. I can no longer care for them as they deserve. But the piano will protect them. It has been my voice, my companion, my only constant. I leave them here, trusting that its song will guide someone kind to them, as it once guided me." Thomas closed the notebook, his hands shaking. The emotions swirling within him were almost too much to bear. Walter's words spoke of a deep, unrelenting loneliness, but also of hope, a fragile, desperate hope that someone would come along to finish what he could not. And somehow, against all odds, Walter's trust had not been misplaced. For a long moment, Thomas sat there in silence, the notebook resting on his lap. The piano's presence loomed over him, no longer just an instrument, but a witness to a story that had spanned years. He could almost hear the echoes of Walter's music, a mournful melody that lingered in the air. Standing up, Thomas looked at the piano with newfound reverence. He placed a hand on its surface, as if to thank it for guarding Walter's secrets and the lives of the 7 puppies. "You didn't just guide me here," he murmured. "You gave them a chance." Clutching the notebook, Thomas left the warehouse with a sense of purpose. The story of Walter Hensley wasn't just one of loss. It was one of resilience, of finding meaning in the most unexpected places. And now, it was Thomas's story too. As he stepped out into the cold light of day, his thoughts turned to the puppies waiting at home. They were Walter's family, but now they were his. He would care for them, not just out of obligation, but because they were a part of something much greater. And as for the piano, its legacy would live on, not in the silence of the warehouse, but in the melodies it inspired Thomas to create. The air in Thomas's apartment was filled with the warm scent of fresh coffee and the faint hum of city life outside. Yet inside, there was a growing sense of serenity and purpose that Thomas hadn't felt in years. On the floor, the 7 golden retriever puppies played clumsily, tumbling over one another in a symphony of tiny barks and wagging tails. Each puppy had started to reveal its unique personality. Dew, the smallest, was timid but affectionate, always seeking the comfort of Thomas's lap. Ree, the boldest, was often the leader of the group, nudging the others into playful mischief. The others, me, F.A., Sol, La, and C, filled the space with an infectious energy that seemed to breathe life back into the once quiet apartment. In the corner of the room, Walter's notebook rested on Thomas's desk, the leather cover worn, but now cherished. Thomas had spent hours poring over the sheet music inside, his fingers tracing the handwritten notes and lyrics. The compositions felt deeply personal, each one a reflection of Walter's journey through loss and resilience. It was as though the melodies carried the weight of Walter's soul, echoing his pain, his hope, and his love for the puppies he had left behind. One evening, Thomas sat at his piano, the notebook propped open on the stand. The puppies had settled into a pile near his feet, their small bodies warm and soft against his legs. Taking a deep breath, he placed his fingers on the keys and began to play the first piece in the notebook. The melody was haunting yet tender, each note resonating with a bittersweet longing. It started softly, like a whisper, before building into a crescendo that seemed to fill the entire room. As Thomas played, he felt a strange connection, almost as if Walter's spirit was guiding his hands, urging him to bring the music to life once more. To his surprise, the puppies stirred. Dew lifted his tiny head, his ears twitching at the sound. Ree let out a curious yip, while the others shuffled closer, their wide eyes fixed on Thomas. One by one, they formed a semicircle around the piano, their heads tilting in unison, as if trying to comprehend the strange, beautiful sounds filling the air. Thomas couldn't help but smile. "What do you think, huh?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible over the music. "Not bad for my first try?" Dew let out a small, approving bark, and Thomas laughed, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in months. The simple act of playing, of seeing the puppies respond to the music, felt like a balm to his soul. For the first time in years, he felt alive, as if the notes were stitching together the frayed edges of his spirit. Night after night, this became their ritual. As Thomas explored the pieces in Walter's notebook, the puppies became his audience. They would gather around him, their tiny tails wagging in rhythm with the melodies. Occasionally one of them, usually Ree, would nudge at the piano bench, as if demanding to be closer to the source of the music. Me, the most playful of the group, often tried to climb onto Thomas's lap mid-song, only to tumble off with a surprise squeak. Each interaction was a reminder of the unspoken bond forming between them, a bond rooted in the shared language of music. One afternoon, Thomas decided to take the puppies outside for a change of scenery. He had a performance scheduled in the park, a casual event where local musicians gathered to share their talent. It was the kind of setting Walter would have thrived in, and Thomas felt it was the perfect place to honor his memory. With the puppies safely tucked into a large carrier lined with blankets, he made his way to the park. The park was alive with the sounds of laughter, chatter, and distant music. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. Thomas set up near a shaded spot under a large oak tree, his piano positioned to face the strolling crowds. He opened the carrier, letting the puppies out to explore the grass. Their tiny paws hesitated at first, but soon they were bounding around, chasing each other in gleeful circles. As Thomas began to play, the first notes drifted into the air, catching the attention of passers-by. Walter's melodies seemed to weave seamlessly into the lively atmosphere of the park, drawing people closer. Children pointed excitedly at the puppies, who had now formed a circle near the piano, their heads tilting in unison as they watched Thomas play. The crowd grew steadily. Some people clapped along with the rhythm, while others simply stood in quiet appreciation. One little girl knelt to pet Doe, who responded with a shy wag of his tail. An older couple smiled warmly as F.A. and Cy playfully tugged at a blade of grass between them. It was as if the music and the puppies had created a moment of pure connection, pulling strangers together in a shared sense of wonder. As the final note of the song faded, a ripple of applause spread through the crowd. Thomas looked up, his heart swelling at the sight of so many smiling faces. The puppies, sensing the energy, barked and wagged their tails excitedly, their joy infectious. For a moment, Thomas felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the applause, but for the journey that had brought him here. A woman in the crowd approached him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "That was beautiful," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The music, the puppies, it's like something out of a dream." Thomas nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "The music isn't mine," he admitted. "It belonged to someone who had a gift for turning pain into something beautiful. I'm just continuing his story." The woman reached out to pet Law, who eagerly licked her hand. "Well, whoever he was, his story is in good hands." As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas sat back on the bench, watching the puppies tumble over one another in the grass. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the park. In that moment, surrounded by music, laughter, and the unrelenting joy of 7 tiny lives, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Walter's melodies had found their way back into the world, and with them, the love he had poured into every note. And as Thomas gathered the puppies and prepared to head home, he realized that they weren't just his audience, they were his family. Together they would carry Walter's legacy forward, one note, one melody, one joyful bark at a time. It was another crisp autumn afternoon in the park, the golden leaves swirling gently in the breeze as Thomas set up for his usual performance. The 7 puppies, now a little more confident and playful, scampered around his feet as he tuned the piano. Their small tails wagged furiously, and every so often Ray would bark sharply, as if urging Thomas to start the music. The park had become their stage, and over the past few weeks, Thomas had gained a small following. Families, couples, and solo wanderers often stopped to watch, drawn in by the harmonious blend of Walter's haunting melodies and the irresistible charm of the puppies. But today, as Thomas began to play, a subtle shift in the crowd caught his attention. An elderly woman, her silver hair neatly tied back and a cane in hand, stood near the edge of the gathering. She watched Thomas intently, her expression soft but somber. When the song ended and the applause rippled through the audience, the woman stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the piano. Thomas noticed her approach and offered a polite smile. "Thank you for listening," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet murmur of the dispersing crowd. The woman nodded, her gaze lingering on the piano. "That's a beautiful instrument," she said, her voice trembling slightly with age. "And the music, it's familiar." Thomas's curiosity piqued. "You've heard it before?" he asked, gesturing toward Walter's notebook, which rested open on the stand. The woman's face softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I have. Those melodies, they belong to someone I cared for deeply. Walter Hensley." The name hit Thomas like a chord striking deeply in his chest. He straightened, his hands instinctively resting on the piano's edge. "You knew Walter?" he asked, his voice laced with both surprise and anticipation. The woman nodded, lowering herself onto a nearby bench with a quiet sigh. "Walter and I were friends for many years. He was complicated, but his heart was good. He had a way of seeing beauty in things most people overlooked, like that piano," she said, nodding toward the instrument. "And those puppies." The mention of the puppies made Thomas glance down. They had gathered around the woman, as if sensing something familiar in her presence. Dew nuzzled her knee gently, earning a chuckle from the woman as she patted his head. She looked up at Thomas, her eyes glistening with emotion. Walter loved animals, dogs especially. He used to say they were the only creatures that truly understood him. Her smile faltered, and she looked away, as if the weight of memory was too much to bear. Thomas waited patiently, sensing that she had more to say. Finally, she continued, her voice quieter now. Toward the end, Walter's health started to fail. He never told anyone how bad it was, but I could see it in his hands. They shook too much to play the way he used to. He was heartbroken, but even then, he never stopped caring for those around him. That's when he found them. The puppies. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He left them by the piano, he said, more to himself than to her. I found them there. 7 of them. The woman's eyes widened briefly before softening. 7, she repeated, a wistful smile touching her lips. He would have loved that. Music and numbers always meant so much to him. She paused, her gaze growing distant. He told me once that he wanted to take them to a shelter, somewhere safe, but he couldn't. Thomas frowned slightly. Why not? The woman hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the handle of her cane. He didn't trust people, she admitted. Not after everything he'd been through. He believed the world had become too cold, too indifferent, but he trusted the piano. He believed that anyone who could hear its voice would have the kindness to save those puppies. Her words hit Thomas with a clarity he hadn't expected. The image of Walter, alone, frail, and yet filled with such hope for the future, tugged at his heart. He glanced down at the puppies, who were now lounging around the woman's feet, their tiny forms a testament to Walter's enduring love. I wish I could have known him, Thomas said quietly. Through his music, I feel like I do. But hearing this, it makes everything so much more real. The woman reached out and placed a hand on his arm. You're keeping his spirit alive, she said, through your music, through these little ones. Walter's story didn't end with him. It's living on in you. Thomas nodded, his mind swirling with emotions. That evening, after the woman had left and the park had grown quiet, he sat alone at the piano, the puppies asleep in their carrier nearby. Walter's notebook lay open before him, its pages now more than just music. They were a legacy. As he placed his hands on the keys, Thomas began to play. This time, the melody wasn't just Walter's, it was his own, woven together with the echoes of a man who had found meaning in the most unlikely places. The notes flowed like a conversation across time, carrying with them a message of love, hope, and the power of connection. And as the final chords faded into the night, Thomas made a silent vow. Walter's story deserved to be told, not just through music, but through words, through action, through the lives of the puppies he had saved. Thomas would ensure that the world knew of the wandering pianist who had turned his sorrow into beauty and left behind a legacy of kindness. The stars overhead seemed to twinkle brighter, as if offering their approval, and beneath them, 7 tiny lives slept soundly, their future forever changed by the music that had brought them together. The weeks following Thomas's encounter with the elderly woman passed in a whirlwind of preparation and purpose. Inspired by her words and the haunting beauty of Walter's music, Thomas resolved to honor the legacy of the man who had unknowingly changed his life. He envisioned a charity concert, something intimate yet powerful, a way to share Walter's story and give the world a glimpse into the extraordinary connection forged through music and compassion. The decision was clear. This concert would be for Walter, for the puppies, and for every soul who had ever found hope in the unlikeliest of places. Thomas threw himself into the planning. He reached out to a small but well-regarded local theater, securing a venue that could seat a few hundred people. He spread the word through social media, posters, and local news outlets, crafting the event as not just a concert, but a celebration of life, love, and second chances. The title was simple, yet poignant. Melodies of Walter, a story of music and hope. The week before the event, Thomas spent every waking hour rehearsing. His apartment was alive with the sound of Walter's compositions, his own interpretations breathing fresh life into the melodies. The puppies were his ever-present audience, their curious eyes following his every movement. They had grown noticeably since that fateful night in the warehouse, their once fragile bodies now filled with boundless energy and life. Yet, amidst their playful chaos, they always seemed to quiet when Thomas sat at the piano, their heads tilting in unison, as if they too understood the gravity of the music. The night of the concert arrived, bringing with it a nervous energy that buzzed through Thomas like an electric current. The theater was aglow with soft golden light, the stage set simply with a grand piano at its center. Rows of seats quickly filled with an audience that ranged from curious locals to those who had heard whispers of Walter's story through the press coverage. Among them was the elderly woman who had first revealed the truth to Thomas, her kind smile a steadying presence in the crowd. Backstage, Thomas knelt beside the puppies, who were now wearing tiny collars adorned with delicate ribbons. He had carefully groomed each of them for the occasion, their golden coats gleaming under the warm lights. Dew, as always, lingered close to him, her small frame pressing against his side. "You ready for this?" Thomas whispered, stroking Dou's soft fur. The puppy looked up at him with her big, trusting eyes, and Thomas couldn't help but smile. "Yeah, me too." The concert began with Thomas stepping onto the stage, the theater falling silent as he took his place at the piano. He began with one of Walter's pieces, the melody unfurling like a story being told for the first time. The music carried with it a raw, emotional depth, and as Thomas played, he felt the weight of Walter's spirit guiding his hands. Between pieces, Thomas shared snippets of Walter's life: the wandering pianist, the man who had loved deeply and lost even more, the caretaker who had found hope in 7 tiny lives. The audience listened intently, their expressions a mix of awe and empathy. "And then," Thomas said, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "he left them beneath his piano, trusting that its music would guide someone to them. I don't know why I was the one who found them, but I do know this: Walter's trust wasn't misplaced." At that, Thomas gestured to the side of the stage where the puppies were waiting. As if on cue, they trotted out one by one, led by Ree, their ribbons bouncing with each step. The audience erupted into delighted laughter and applause as the puppies explored the stage, their tails wagging furiously. Dew stayed close to Thomas, her small frame trembling slightly at the sudden noise. But when he reached down to scoop her into his arms, she nestled against him with a soft whimper. "These are Walter's notes," Thomas said, holding Dew up for the audience to see. "His unfinished melody. And tonight, I hope we can help them find the homes they deserve." The second half of the concert took on a celebratory tone. Between songs, Thomas introduced each puppy, sharing a little about their personalities and quirks. Families in the audience eagerly stepped forward, expressing their desire to adopt. A young couple immediately fell in love with Ray, charmed by his bold and adventurous nature. A retired teacher claimed me, drawn to the puppy's playful energy. One by one, the puppies were paired with new families, their futures now filled with love and care. But when it came time for Doe, Thomas hesitated. The smallest puppy had always been by his side, her quiet resilience a constant source of comfort. He glanced down at her, her tiny head resting against his chest, and felt a pang of certainty. Dew wasn't just a puppy. She was a connection to Walter, to the music, to the journey that had brought him here. "She's staying with me," Thomas announced, his voice firm yet warm. The audience responded with applause, and Thomas smiled, feeling Dou's small tail wag against his arm. By the end of the night, the theater was alive with joy and connection. Families left with their new companions, and many stayed to thank Thomas for sharing Walter's story. The elderly woman approached him once more, her eyes shining with pride. "You've done more than honor him," she said softly. "You've carried him forward." As Thomas packed up the piano and prepared to leave, he looked down at Doe, who was now curled up in her carrier, fast asleep. The music had quieted, the stage was empty, but Thomas felt no sadness. The journey was far from over. Walter's story would continue, not just in the lives of the puppies, but in every note Thomas played. Walking out into the crisp night air, Thomas looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, Walter." And with Dew tucked safely by his side, he stepped into the next chapter of their journey together. Years passed, and the memory of that stormy night in the warehouse never faded from Thomas's mind. It became a pivotal moment in his life, a moment that transformed him from a struggling artist to a man with a purpose. The story of Walter and the 7 puppies had not only shaped his music, but also touched the hearts of countless others. Thomas's career as a pianist flourished in ways he never could have imagined. His performances were no longer just about the technical brilliance of his music, but about the emotion, the humanity behind each note. Audiences came not just to hear his compositions, but to experience the story he carried with him, a story of love, loss, and the unyielding power of kindness. Every time he played Walter's melodies, he felt a connection that transcended time, as if the wandering pianist himself was seated beside him, nodding in quiet approval. One of Thomas's most significant milestones came when he was approached by the city's Cultural Preservation Society. They had heard the story of Walter and were moved by the way Thomas had brought his music and legacy back to life. Together, they worked to create a permanent exhibit in the city's music museum, The Melodies of Walter Hensley. The exhibit became a celebration of Walter's life and artistry. At its heart stood the very piano Thomas had found in the warehouse, lovingly restored to its former glory. Beside it, Walter's notebook was displayed in a glass case, its pages open to one of his most poignant compositions. Photographs of the 7 golden retriever puppies adorned the walls, each one accompanied by a short story about their lives in their new homes. Visitors to the exhibit often lingered by the piano, imagining the melodies that had once echoed from its keys. Some even left handwritten notes, thanking Walter for his music and Thomas for sharing his story. It became a place of reflection, a space where people could be reminded of the profound impact one life could have on others. As for the puppies, their lives were a testament to the love and care Walter had hoped for them. Each had found a home where they were cherished and adored. Thomas kept in touch with their new families, receiving photos and updates that warmed his heart. Ree had become the loyal companion of a young couple, accompanying them on hiking adventures. Mee brought endless joy to her retired teacher, who swore the puppy had inspired her to start painting again. And Do, the smallest and most fragile of the 7, remained by Thomas's side, growing into a strong and spirited dog who rarely left his heels. Do had become a part of Thomas's performances, often sitting quietly by the piano during concerts, her presence a reminder of the journey they had shared. Audiences adored her, and she had become something of a symbol for the story of Walter's legacy. Wherever Thomas went, people would ask about her, and she greeted them all with a wag of her tail and her gentle, soulful eyes. On the anniversary of Walter's passing, Thomas visited the museum alone, bringing Do with him. The exhibit was quiet in the early morning, the soft glow of the lights giving the space an almost sacred feeling. Thomas stood before the piano, his fingers grazing the keys as memories flooded back. Beside him, Do sat patiently, her gaze fixed on the piano. Thomas chuckled softly. "What do you think, girl? Should we play one more time?" Sitting down, he opened Walter's notebook to the first piece he had ever played. The melody flowed effortlessly from his fingers, filling the room with a sound that was both mournful and triumphant. Do rested her head on his foot, her eyes closing as if lulled by the familiar tune. When the final note faded, Thomas closed the notebook and exhaled deeply. "Thank you, Walter," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "for everything." As he stood to leave, a museum curator approached him, her smile warm. "You know," she said, "this exhibit has inspired so many people. It's not just about the music or the story, it's about hope. It's about believing that kindness can make a difference." Thomas nodded, his hand resting gently on Do's head. "That's what Walter taught me," he replied, "that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance to create something beautiful." The story of Walter and Thomas became a legend in the city, passed down through generations as a reminder of the transformative power of love and compassion. Walter's melodies were played in schools, parks, and homes, and his legacy lived on in the music that continued to inspire. For Thomas, life with Do remained rich with purpose and joy. Together, they traveled the world, sharing the story of a wandering pianist who had found meaning in the unlikeliest of places. And every time Thomas sat at a piano, he knew Walter's spirit was there, in every note, in every melody, and in the unwavering loyalty of a little golden dog who had become his greatest companion. In the end, Walter's legacy was more than music. It was a testament to the enduring bond between humans and animals, the power of second chances, and the beauty of a heart that never stopped giving.